So I want to say good morning to everybody. Hola, Natalia. Hola, todos. We are really happy to have Natalia Nicolaidis with us today to share your vast experience and your point of view. Natalia, I will give a brief introduction. Natalia, you have your undergrad degree from Yale. Then you went off to Georgetown to do your JD and a master's in foreign services at Georgetown. Then you went off to Europe to the École d'Europe at Bruges to do another diploma on international law. Is it like a master's?
It's a master's, for European Community Law back then in 1990. Mm-hmm.
Fantastic. And then after that, I guess you must have joined quite young Credit Suisse, and you had a fantastic career of 24 years at Credit Suisse. You became managing partner of the legal department and co-head of investment banking division for Europe, Middle East and Asia. You did that for 18 years. Then you became also global head of risks and controls for all investment banking for 6 years, and then general counsel for investment banking and capital markets. So that was a fantastic career. And now you're actually founding partner and of this new consultancy advisory firm that does all this work and advises boards and senior management specializing on sustainable corporate culture and focusing on governance and other ESG objectives and organizational structures and risk management. So we are delighted to have you, and we wish, we could have a lot more time, but we still have like an hour to listen to you, and I encourage everybody to please give us questions. So good morning and thank you.
Good morning and thank you, Cecilia. Gracias a todos. I wish I could speak more in Spanish. I actually had 5 years in Latin America when I was in private practice between law school and going at Credit Suisse, which is actually why I ended up at Credit Suisse. Someone noticed that in my CV I spoke Spanish, and then that was the beginning of a whole adventure, starting with Mexico, then in Chile, then Colombia. I did not do much in Argentina, I'm afraid, other than change airplanes when we were fogged on the way down to Chile. But it was an amazing experience, which gave me a lot of access to senior management at the various institutions that were listing back in 1990 in the US. It was just when Rule 144A was made available. And so there was an onslaught of listings on NYSE by Latin American issuers. And I was dispatched to due diligence in many of these locations. And I have wonderful experiences. So thank you all for having me here today. And this is just really my experience, and I'm not an expert in the field, but I've been in it for a while, and so this is not really anything formal, and I invite you to interrupt me as much as you want, and actually afterwards, if we don't all get to speak, feel free to email me in case I can help in any way I can, but you be the judge of what you want to do afterwards. Just for now, I wanted to just really do a little bit of an explanation of my journey. So far, I told you about my private practice, which was mainly in corporate finance. But then when I was invited to join the Credit Suisse legal department in New York, it was really an M&A position that they were looking to fill. The peak of that ended up with the acquisition of the Garantia investment bank in Brazil. And I did the proprietary acquisition of the group, working a lot with the senior people, and how to retain personnel became an important part of the franchise. And so, spend a lot of time, thinking about what looks good in terms of talent management and how people actually develop loyalty to a completely new institution. In 2000, Credit Suisse bought DLJ, and that led me to move from New York to London, because the legal department in London was very, very small. We didn't have a lot of capital markets employees there. And so in legal, they needed to help with the transition. And so I led the effort to try to do a lot of the high yield work that DLJ brought to the table. And it was very exciting because it was, again, a new trend that was just starting. Europe was getting very busy, and the emerging markets started, getting on fire back in 2000. And it led us to a lot of work in the Balkans and in Russia. And I got a lot of experience very quickly on getting thrown to the fire and having really to swim very fast until Lehman happened. And then everything changed at that point. All of a sudden, the regulators started looking back at what we had been doing all these years. Were our practices sound? What kind of evidence did we have for our opinions, not only in legal, but also in the front? How did the various committees approve our transactions? So this was very exciting for me because it meant that all of a sudden I had to a little bit change hats and stop being a lawyer and become much more, of a transaction manager that was looking at what good looked like, what sound advice was, in order to be a trusted advisor to our senior management. In 2014, the guy that ended up being the CEO of the investment bank asked me to change roles entirely and do this transition in what Cecilia mentioned, the risk role, which really was meant to establish a framework for responding to all the regulatory inquiries that we were getting, but housing this effort from the first line of defense, from banking itself. So I left legal, and really compliance was also an adjunct of that function, but we were advising them on the initiatives that we wanted to pursue because we considered them to be material risk for the firm. So I looked at the decision making and how we accepted franchise risk on deals, how the conflicts of interest worked for the firm, and then how the whole area of talent retention, training, and generally this whole thing that turned out to be a culture initiative was changing the way that people were doing business. A lot of people had dropped off from the middle ranks. So the director workforce that was really the keeper, if you will, of the standards and of some know-how was changing. And so the juniors needed a lot of help in trying to having these dialogues with senior management and in gaining training and asking for what they really needed. And so that was the result of the crisis. And that's what the role focused on, these three big pillars. And I did that globally, which meant not that it was, anything sexy, but it was really changing, the mindset from culture to culture as to what was important in what jurisdiction. So there was a different set of challenges in Asia, a different set in the Americas, and different set in Europe. So I think that led me to understand a little bit more of what is expected from the role of a good counsel, not necessarily one that just looks at the transactions, but one that ensures that the franchise that we're all trying to cultivate and to not fall into trouble, doesn't really miss a step and forget about an important priority. So then we got a new CEO in 2015, and Tijan Thiam changed the way that we were divisionally aligned, and that's where I was invited to become the general counsel of the division. And that brought a new set of interesting issues that we had to all look at. The principal issue turned out to be reputational risk for me, because the world had been changing then. And of course, it culminated now in this whole COVID challenge. But, back in 2016, 2017, on the back of the regulatory work that we were all, so much focused on, we were seeing that our stakeholders were broadening their base. It wasn't just the shareholders. It was not only the regulators, but we were getting activist investors, to knock on the door of many clients. We got, of course, a lot of different litigation, and a lot of you today we will have gotten in contact with at the time. And then we got the asset manager firms also telling us what they were expecting out of the transactions that we were working on. So I think this is a good segue to kind of leap into, what is the role of someone who's building a career today with so many uncertainties, should look like? Because if you try to distill some of the lessons that I've learned, I think, you will see that it's a complicated matrix. It revolves around, a lot of cultural initiatives that are important to where you're doing business. It turns out to have a lot to do with the culture of the regulators and whether they're taking a very active view or whether they're waiting for the court system, to take the preeminent role in checking deal making in the financial markets. And it turns out to be the confidence of the investor base. And this is a very fragile thing. Reputation is one of the things that we mentioned, but also it's good returns. So we have to all, be very realistic about being, in a solid economic and a stable function that, we just create more opportunities for stable deal making that feeds, not only the law firms such as yourselves, but also the banks, the asset managers, and the investors at the end of the day. So, it's difficult to kind of distill what this experience really, at the end of the day brings in 2 or 3 principles. But if I can try, I think I will probably say this. We live in a world that, like I said, is complicated, and it's benefiting from different dynamics. You're seeing that consumption growth is such in the cities currently that it attracts more better educated people, and with that we will have a number of women come up that principally before may have not been as educated in the countryside. We will see retiree communities that will require better healthcare, especially post-COVID, and crisis management, relating to not only healthcare, but also nursing homes, hospitals, etc. We will see, the productivity being challenged of big companies as profits, are challenged from supply chain issues, etc. And so all that will mean that, we will have a more fragmented world in which we will be asked to contribute. And the way in which I think, you can say that you can deal with so many questions will have to be around, being passionate about, what you're working on, ensuring that you have a renewed set of skills that, is relevant. So if you're seeing an area potentially that is dropping off from being important driver of the economy, let's say capital markets reaches a slow point, you should feel comfortable and confident enough to look for other work that could be beneficial to you. Maybe it's restructuring, maybe it's litigation, and in a smaller setting, you should feel, very confident in asking for different experiences that you can contribute and learn from. I think it's important not to put, your intellectual pride at issue when the market shifts are so drastic as we're experiencing right now. I mean, there is going to be a competition for talent, clearly, but I think it's a kind of talent pool that people are going to be looking for that is in the way that they're looking at problems in general, more than being, strictly the transaction managers that people may have considered were important probably 20 years ago. And technology is having a huge impact in all this. I think that, all the AI solutions that are developing, and no one is, the guru yet in what the best solution is, but, increasingly we're finding out that there are platforms that are helping us do our job faster and easier, and then you can focus on more value add, propositions for the firm and for yourselves. So I think I would encourage you all to take, these challenges as opportunities. Maybe we are not all tech savvy, but then I think we probably all need to find out what these tools can offer us in order to do our job better. When it comes down to diversity, I think, I must say I had great experience at setting up the Diversity and Inclusion Committee for Europe. It transcended legal. It was all the functions in the bank. And it was back in a time where it wasn't so much in fashion, if you will, but it came out of really a very realistic issue relating to people dropping off from the workforce. We were losing talent and we were losing loyalty, and there was only one way to try to address that. And we set out to have a conversation with the women that were leaving, and we started inviting a lot of them back in a program that we call the Real Returns Program, that allowed the women that had left to either start a family, and then some of them were looking at caring for elder parents, to come back, not necessarily in areas that they felt that they had left from, but areas that they thought that their skill set was more amenable to deploying in a corporate setting. So we found people that were principally before in legal come back and do audit work, or they could come back and do compliance work. And that actually rang a bell in my mind about how some of the skills that we have can be interchangeable. And the fact that, we have them and people can come back, 10 years later, sometimes 15 years later, and still add so much value, both to the corporate setting, but also to their own self-confidence, means that, there's a deep pool of talent within us. And, we should be looking at that when we are actually building our careers, rather than just only look back in time when we've left it or trying to reignite them. So, with that, I think I would say that, while it's interesting to engender loyalty as a senior management in a firm, from the perspective, I think, of someone who's looking to build a career, I think it's important to think of, how you put your skill set together so that it expresses what you're passionate about and what you can see yourself doing, but don't have just one mold in your mind, because, I went to risk without having any risk background, and that proved to be probably the best thing that I ever did, in terms of doing the role that I did later. It was a different kind of general counsel role that was made available to me because it was a risk manager role more than, just a strictly legal role. The other thing I think I want to say is that I really benefited from having sponsorship in the firm by people that would actually, listen to the challenges that I was having. I don't think, I was the kind of person that thought, okay, I will do this on my own, and I'm, very proud to just only come up with my own approach. I talked to a lot of people all the time just about, what was available to us in terms of tools, what the challenges were in other divisions. And so in talking to people, you will find that there are a lot of different people that will have similar values to yourselves, and that they will be very, very happy, to sponsor you in a meaningful way. And I'm not just talking about mentorship here, because that's potentially a different area we can cover in a minute. But I think sponsorship really revolves around how can you drive some results, to navigate the process of being in a large entity. And, it will have different elements in it. It will have, performance reviews. It will have promotion. It will have, God help us, sometimes even disciplinary questions that come up. And, to have an ally in this context, I think is always a good thing, because it will just show you that you're not, alone, and that if you have a difficult situation, you can have an independent person by your side, to explain to you, sometimes to mediate, and, oftentimes to just champion you, which is very important. On the issue of mentorship, I also invite you to all think about it. And I'm not just talking to women here. I think men are equally benefited from having important mentors in their careers. We all need, especially now where we're all remotely working, to expand really the ways in which we think, and to find people that have, walked the same path that we have can only benefit us. Very often they have their own networks, and they can introduce us to their networks. And it's very important that we can, enrich our networks with theirs. So in the first years, you think probably, oh my God, I have so much work. I'm so busy. I have so many competing priorities. Do I really have time for a network? But I urge you not to put that aside. It's important that you build it now, and that you build it early, because it's really late to have, a meaningful and an authentic network when you're actually, reached what you think is a very mature stage of your career. Because, people will remember you when you're actually trying to, to network when you were starting out. And it's important to find people that have struggled alongside yourselves, and don't be proud about how you do it. Sometimes just thank God LinkedIn is making this much easier for us now. But just to say, look, this is an area I'm exploring. What do you think about it? And, someone will send you an article. Sometimes people will send you, an idea, and just follow through with the curiosity. I think that's an important part. Curiosity is something that, may sound like a big word, but without it, I really don't know how you transcend doing even, sometimes the necessary tasks that may look menial to you at the time, but you really need to transcend them in order to propel your career forward.
Right.
I really, think it's not much more than that. It's really trying to look, you're obviously, I'm taking for granted you're going to do the best job you can, and you're going to put in the effort that you need to put in order to ensure that your clients' interests are being represented. So I'm not even, addressing some of these concerns, but I by the same token, I don't feel that having a balance and a thoughtful way in which you manage your career is conflicting with that priority. In reality, I think everyone will support you if you have very clear views about how you want to progress. And I don't mean that, like I said in the beginning, in a linear way. You can progress, in this environment in a very, strategically, broad and holistic way. And, we're seeing currently that governance is such an important part, and ESG of the issues that are being presented to us. This environmental, social and governance space is being opened up as investors are taking more and more pride into how companies work. So, if you have concerns around some of those initiatives, and you're really thinking maybe that's not for you right now, I'm not just bringing an example, but then maybe down the road, maybe you want to participate in some of these issues, this is the time to do it when you see so much fragmentation in the way, in which we're all approaching our careers. And I'm not just talking about people that are building them, but about even people that are having a more mature career in front of them, that are looking, for the next challenge. I think by and large, these are the things that I wanted to say, Cecilia, and I wanted to broaden it up for people that have specific questions.
Sure. Great. Thank you so much. And I think you mentioned several things that we are really keen on doing at the firm, and you mentioned talking to other people and working, in team efforts. Of course, that's what we do, and there's no other way, and for us to do it, because the clients that want to come to Marval, they come because they have a complex issue, and complex issues means working in teams with different, practice areas, etc. So I think that one of the values that we've always, been very adamant about, and all our young lawyers understand and very quickly about our culture, is that teamwork and collaboration is basic, and that's the way we do it. And of course, our firm is not as big as a big investment bank, but still, we have different departments, and it's still a big place for Argentine standards. It's the biggest firm, so it's still a big place, and it is even. I think that one of the things that you mentioned also, networking and creating that network since you're young, because we are creating networks all the time without realizing. So doing that early, I think, is fantastic, and realizing that you're doing. So it's really just being conscious about what you're already doing, because you're creating your network inside the firm. You're creating a network outside with, all colleagues from other firms that you work on a deal, and clients, and of course, and other, people you meet on things that you have in common, of course. Natalia, I think that one of the things that would be also really interesting to hear from you, I think that two sides of things. One is, from your personal perspective, and we can, if you want to, we can leave that till the end, or we can switch also to how you see the role of outside counsel, and what you found, because you did transactional work at the beginning, yeah. And so when you did transactional work, and when you used to work a lot, I imagine, with outside counsel from all different jurisdictions, how, I mean, what would you say were the most important, things that you were looking for to get? What sort of support? How, I mean, which would be the tips of what an in-house counsel wants to receive from their outside counsel?
That's a very good question. Thank you, Cecilia. And I think it's a very difficult role that external counsel has, especially when they're advising more than one bank, because I can see how it can put a very difficult situation in front of especially a junior lawyer that's getting 2 or 3 institutions, especially in a capital market syndicate, have conflicting points that they want to stress and they want to secure. And so I remember the days when it felt like we were putting some of you in an awkward spot by asking you to promote for example, an indemnity provision, which another bank was not so much interested in defending, etc. So, when you feel in a position where you feel potentially conflicted by, demands that are coming from different parties, I think the only right thing to do is to explain your situation, of course, to make sure that you've explained to your client, and that is every client, what their point, with the importance of their point, and the fact that it may turn out to be that they don't end up getting it. However, they should ensure that they don't stop pressing for that, among their counterparts, because you're not in the position to always be the one that the point. And I can totally see that. But it's also the responsibility of external counsel to say, listen, I understand something that's potentially institutionally important to you. However, within your own ranks, make sure that you have that conversation, because, if you have a Credit Suisse and a Morgan Stanley disagreeing with the Bank of America, that's not for Marval Maral to just, resolve. Sometimes you really have to rely on the legal in-house team to take care of, some of those questions. So, feel confident in standing for that. I think another area where I found, different experiences with external counsel was on the due diligence. The standards of due diligence, in my experience, have slipped over the years because, transactions are much faster in the way in which they're executing, the margins are declining. And so there is a race to the bottom, in addition to finding, very, very short windows of especially listing securities. And so I think diligence is something that sometimes can suffer. And it's important that when you see, questions that are not being asked because of very, very expedient timetables, or when you're seeing that, risks that you have just an inkling that have not been addressed in the right way or in an adequate way, you communicate that with the in-house department. The bankers, sometimes are going to be looking at the next thing. They're going to be valuing the assets. They're going to be valuing the stock. But the legal department is really responsible, especially for the reputational angle of the deal, that is going to be vouching for the correct due diligence. And, you won't get it right every time. And, it's also very, I'm afraid, unfair that diligence, is run by the most junior people in teams sometimes. That's how I did my first steps of Latin American corporate finance. I was sent to due diligence. However, you really have to ensure that that is your responsibility and you don't delegate it to anyone else. If you feel awkward about raising an issue that's been ignored by, but the working group, ensure that your manager knows about that. That's important. I think as you grow a little bit more in your seniority, you will notice trends in the way deal making is conducted. So to the extent that you can take a step back, or, together with other team members or firm members, that you can have a dialogue, an active dialogue with your team and your client in-house, I urge you to do that, whether it's in a relationship setting or a very, very informal way of saying, listen, we've noticed like 3 or 4 trends that I think, we've seen them across the industry, and we would really think that you would benefit from our perspective. So be proactive in terms of flagging those. And, to the extent there is take up, potentially, that's also a business opportunity, for the law firm. And it's certainly something that in-house teams value. It's not part of the, the regular, relationship setting that you expect to go through all sorts of, KPIs. But I think it's an important part of developing trust, and developing trust between the in-house team and the external team of lawyers is probably as important as everything we've said today.
Fantastic. And did you find, were you frequently asked to give feedback on performance of law firms, for example? Was that a pain in the neck, or did you enjoy, if you are asked for feedback, do you think in-house counsels tend to prefer to do it, after a transaction, or like every 2 years, a conversation, or when we've done this before, but not many times. We try not to hassle clients, but questionnaires or some sort of interviews. How do you think that is perceived by in-house counsel, especially at banks where people are so busy and always with high workloads and pressure?
It's a good question, because, this has developed. It's interesting. From the time I started, I kept a database with all the transactions and the performance of every member, of a deal team externally. And so that was kept in an internal drive. And to me, it was very important, because I would use that as a guidepost for going to the next transaction and awarding a piece of business. So I think people should be conscious that they're being, not rated per se, but definitely, judged in a way that is helpful or not helpful to a solution at a critical juncture in a transaction. Today, there seems to be a much more institutionalized tool that the banks are using. There are platforms, electronic platforms, including one that was introduced to me recently called Top 3 Legal, where all the banks are putting into this database their views of counsel, and not just banks, I should say, it's corporates as well. And they're putting, by name and by expertise, a qualification of the type of service they're getting. And that is a confidential proprietary tool that every institution keeps for itself, and therefore, rates its people, in a way that is helpful to them for, again, the next piece of business that they want to award. The communication with the law firms about performance is something that I think sometimes falls by the wayside, and it's very important that it be brought up in a relationship meeting. Frankly, like I said, all this information can reside very, helpfully within databases of either, the bank itself or this electronic platform, but it's not always communicated to a law firm. And so I find it's important, in order to rectify, misunderstandings at the time of a transaction. I mean, it doesn't have to be exactly at the time of a transaction, but it could be at regular intervals, in order to address any lingering issues, which you really, really, don't want to fester. Sometimes it's just a misunderstanding, or sometimes, like I said before, it's because you've pressed a point that another bank, for example, may have held to critical importance. So having this dialogue is important. And I think sometimes it shows that it's not just, the external participants that are being judged, but it's also the internal participants, which could have been unclear in the directions, or it could have been conflicting in terms of the points that they were pressing. So it's really good to keep that while the institutional knowledge is getting built.
Wow, that's very interesting. Do you know if fees are part and of the information that is put into this database?
That's a good question. It's a very good question, and it should be in there, because you're absolutely right. The fees are being driven down, and we all know how difficult that is. And so with lower fees, I think the expectation is that you're going to get a very different type of service.
Well, sometimes, well, we all try not to give a different sort of service, but it's true that the pressure for especially when the market doesn't have very I would say complicated or sophisticated transactions, that's when it gets more complicated, because plain vanilla deals are, you know, they don't really leave the margin that you would want. So, but we still do them because of course we want to be close to the clients. So that's always a challenge. Do you think, if you had to think about what do you think is the most common mistake that you would see outside counsel make, not technical relationships, in relationships with the clients? What do you think is the most common mistake that we tend to do when we deal with in-house counsel? Is it not getting the in-house counsel involved on time? Is it lack of communication or availability? What do you think, you know, if you had to think backwards, you would see as a trend? Or maybe it depends on the jurisdiction. I don't know. I mean,
I guess two things come to mind. The two little areas to focus on. The first, the tendency for counsel to be involved, you know, in different iterations of deals. So, you know, from one deal to the next, to the next, to the next, and banks can get added from one deal to the next, to the next, to the next. And what I had found to be a common concern, which, you know, frankly drove me to insanity, was the assumption that, you know, a bank or an in-house team would have known, you know, why certain things were happening, and importantly in opinions. So in a 10b5, I'll give that as an example, where there were, you know, carve-outs, and, you know, and that was something that may have been negotiated with a group of banks in the beginning, but, you know, you wouldn't have known about that until the very end. And it's not just so much, you know, about itself and an opinion, but also the work that's behind it. You know, the fact that there's an assumption that that kind of work does not need to be performed, and that everyone has gone through all the details on all aspects of a transaction just because they're joining a syndicate that potentially pre-existed. So I think, to the extent something is an important material area of a deal, especially of a complicated deal, I would stress, you know, the importance of ensuring that the in-house team know about it. I mean, it's not, you know, your job to ensure that they're happy with it. By, you know, by all means, it's for them to, you know, go fight it out. But you know, it's complicated, because you get the financial statements carved out from 10b5s. That's the job of the accountants. And then if you start taking out different areas and the transactions are complicated, you know, you have a very exposed in-house team that still has to present itself in front of a committee and, you know, vouch for the good functioning of the deal. And so that's something that I think you can help on if you do that. The other point on what a common misperception might look like in this space is something that we are discovering progressively, as I said before, with technology coming more available to some of the law firms. It's the fact that I think there's the expectation that the banks and larger corporates are paying for value-add advice. So to the extent that, you know, something feels like it's existed in such a way that is commoditized, the advice is so basic and so used, then there is a little bit of a hesitance on the side of, you know, the in-house team that you're going to be talking to, and they will be insisting that actually the senior partner is the one that kind of justifies the existence of the law firm on the transaction. So how do I kind of decode what I just said? There, unfortunately, because that's how we all learned, you know, the work that goes in, the very thorough work that goes in sometimes from a very junior team is not really what gets a very, senior member of an in-house team excited. They want to talk to the person that's going to give them the judgment. And, to ensure that happens, it's important that the junior team members have this kind of conversation, like I said, for an example's sake, on diligence matters, with a senior partner. So it can't be that this judgment develops, out of nowhere. You need to have it solidly based in the transaction setting. But you will see that it becomes much more a value proposition kind of work that the larger corporates and banks are turning to, the more that they're discovering AI solutions and alternative legal service providers also coming in and doing big chunks of work. So they can do, on a project basis, something that potentially, would have been farmed out in another life to a law firm. And so when that happens, aspects of a transaction get taken away from what the law firm, can alternatively provide. So it's really, within the senior members of the team to ensure that the firm as a whole gets deployed for providing its judgment.
Great. Yeah, that sounds familiar. So that's a very, very useful tip, and about judgment and how, help the in-house team have all the tools to do the risk evaluation, and never assume that because you've been copied in emails for a while, you have had the time to follow all the discussion. And so if there's an issue, we have to raise it, and it's important that we raise it in a way that so that the in-house team feels confident that we are, again, we're working in a team, in-house and outside counsel working in a team to make sure that then there are no surprises later on along, or last minute surprises when these issues, that's the worst, I think, if they explode last minute. So
absolutely,
yeah, clearly. Do you think you talked? You made several comments about new challenges in the legal industry. Do you see this evolving differently or did you see this evolving differently in different jurisdictions? Do you think Latin America and the Americas and Europe are going at the same pace in that, with respect to alternative service providers, with respect to these AI developments? Asia, how do you see that? Is that a common trend in every jurisdiction, or do you think it's different because of culture or different aspects? Is it different in different jurisdictions?
That's a great question, and I think there is a big difference. I think Europe is at the forefront of this because of its fragmentation, and because no one company, not one jurisdiction is big enough to really justify some of the big fees that are being spent. And so that's where the alternative service providers come in to disrupt the market, and they do that by taking parts of something that they can do quickly, well, and cheaply. But the same phenomenon has not really taken up as much in other jurisdictions. Importantly, in the US and in Latin America, I've seen much less of it so far. But by that, I don't mean that the proposition is not out there and and these companies having their sights at globalizing their networks. Potentially, some of the ways in which the bar has treated the consultancy firms entering into this space, how the big four are covering, for example, the legal market, which has been something that's been permissible in some jurisdictions but not in others, paves the way for how these alternative service platforms are going to be developing. Sometimes they're providing legal advice, sometimes they're just providing the tools as on a project basis almost for certain work to be done, especially in litigation. And so I think if you can confirm to me my expectation, which is in Latin America, there hasn't been so much of what I've seen in Europe. I think that would be in line with what I've said.
Okay, that's interesting. Yes, I think we've also been seeing more of it in Europe, and a lot of UK-based firms, offering a lot of these services, I think. But I was interested to see if that was also the trend. And how about in Asia? Is Asia, that has always been so keen and is so forward with technology? Do you see, is this an issue for Asian firms also, or is it
not so much? Surprisingly, and I would have expected it to be the case, but because I think the transactions, domestically are not so large, and to the extent that they list on either a European or on a US market, that's the focus of the execution. It's not so much to date in Asia, like I think I'm witnessing in LATAM, but again, that's probably going to change in time as there's a pressure on cost.
I think it will, no? This pressure is coming from everywhere. So I think you're absolutely right that the value added is going to be the key issue here. Moving now, and before I please want to encourage anybody who has a question, please don't hesitate to put it on the chat. Raise your hand. I would be, of course, Natalia is keen on answering any questions.
Absolutely.
Going to a more personal, if you want, side of your career and tips, if you have to think about 3 good decisions that you took in your career, what do you think those would be?
I think the first one was to actually take a risk, which at the time probably was a little uninformed. And that was to cover somebody's maternity leave, not knowing how long it was going to be, in addition to my own work. So that, I think, was a little bit wrong, because I assumed it was going to be a 3-month maternity leave, which is what you got in the States, but I was in London and it turned out to be a year. So in addition to equity capital markets, I ended up doing debt capital markets, investment and high yield, which was a very, very large book of work for a time that, it was a busy time. And so it was a little bit crazy. At the time, I almost regretted it, but it turned out that I met the guy who ended up being the CEO of Investment Bank, who was the leader of, that business group, the debt capital markets. And so, by having him appreciate, the extra effort that went into, sustaining that legal coverage, and also getting to know him personally on the deals, helped me much later. And it's unquestionable that it was really just by virtue of, an extension that this opportunity came. If I had stayed within my comfort zone, it sounds a little bit trite, but it wasn't, because it happened to me. So, that's how it happened.
Fantastic.
It's a little bit similar in, again, the transition to the risk role that I did. The focus from the regulators, like I mentioned before, was something that was really, and the way in which we were responding to it was making me uncomfortable. We were always scrambling to put together, evidence that we knew existed. And it was very important for us to demonstrate that the work had already been done right. But we always had such tight deadlines that it was frustrating. So that prompted me to make this suggestion to actually, sit down and try to create a proactive team in order to work with some of this, participants. The stakeholders were all over the bank. Like I said, the work was being undertaken already, but how do you put it together and propose it was important. And to actually say that And, I didn't have a lot of support at the time because it was a proposition that had to be proved. And so we ended up working with consultants. We invited Deloitte and Oliver Wyman and PwC. So I had 3 different groups of consultants to try to help me do the work. And again, it was probably crazy in the way it was done. There was a lot of work, but it was a proposition that ended up being proven. And it was also a great opportunity for me career-wise, as well as perspective. It propelled me into an area that I wouldn't have otherwise known much about. Fantastic. And then I guess the last point that I would make, Cecilia, is really to just approach people that I admire. We've said it so many times, but I think there's no overstressing of the fact that, unless in this environment in which we're in, both competitive as well as challenging by its nature, if you don't have allies to really think things through and to help you navigate the space you're in, I think, you will find very quickly that you can be marginalized in large organizations or in environments that are just really, really competitive. I think it's important to work within a power base that actually can create momentum. So I found that, the Women's Network was both a fascinating environment for me to learn and grow from other women that I was meeting, but also presented me with the types of initiatives that created confidence that eventually, I integrated both within my own work and in the way in which I involved others. And so, whatever, if it's not that and it's something similar to that and you have a cause that you're passionate about, I think these are all opportunities on which you can build. And from that point of confidence, I think you can grow, as opposed to, being just a very technical person that, sits within their own, room and doesn't really communicate about things that they can help improve.
Fantastic. That's a great point. Thank you so much. Natalia, we have a question from Martin Benzadon. Martin, if you want to go ahead.
Yeah.
Yes, hi, Natalia. Thank you very much for the excellent and very interesting presentation. Really, you raised so many issues that you let us thinking about many things.
Thank you.
I have just one very short question that Cecilia already asked, that is regarding fees. It's a kind of a mystery to us what happens on the other side of the fence, how in-house lawyers deal with different budgets, different estimates, why they choose a firm, reputation, and the like. When you talk about due diligence, you said that you wanted to have the best due diligence, and I understand that. But on this side, we have to see how to propose a reasonable rate to the client.
Yeah, it's an excellent question. And one that, I have a hard time answering, Martin, in reality, because it's a complicated discussion. I think what I would suggest is you absolutely have a dialogue,
Okay.
away from just submitting something without understanding the assumptions. In your case, I would have an extensive discussion about the priorities that are trying to be stressed, about the types of staffing that the client is going to be providing. Because if you end up being with a very small team and you need to deploy a lot of you, it's a different cost proposition from having a very extensive team of clients. And then, transactions change during their progression. And so become more involved and complicated. To be clear about, from the person that instructs you, very often, we tend to keep people on their caps, and then only to see that they're busted before, the deal has even gotten structured. And I think that's an important thing, because, even if you build the most robust assumptions in a sheet of paper that you serve your client, a lot of the goodwill sometimes gets used up. And you don't want to find yourself in that position, because, then the perception is, oh my God, I'm becoming a pain, and that's not a good thing. I want to show my loyalty. So I think what I ensure that you have this relationship so that you can pick up the phone as much as you can. And even if you can't do it, work with, if it's a US counsel, with that counsel, if it's a UK counsel, with that counsel, just ensure that that's getting, put across, because the pressures that I've seen, put up on the law firms are dramatic, and I'm very conscious of what is being asked. It's very, very confusing, and I think sometimes, you know, the message is so unclear that, you know, it can really put the reputation of the product in question, which is the last thing that any of us want. So I think be proactive in how you go about that.
Excellent, Natalia. Great advice. Thank you very much.
Natalia, we have time for one more, I think, before we're only a minute, you know, over time. So we also have a question from one of our senior associates, Agustina, who's a senior associate in one of now oil and gas and also corporate finance. Natalia, she says, thank you so much for sharing your life experience with us. Is there something you regret doing or something you would have done differently?
It's a good question, but one that, again, unfortunately is not simple, because I guess what I should say is that, look, priorities change all the time. Priorities. So I raised a family, and, you know, I did it. You know, my husband was working, traveling the entire time. And so I may have taken a while to achieve some of the goals that potentially, you know, I could have achieved earlier if I'd prioritized my work exclusively outside of my family life. So it depends on how you look at it. I mean, to me, it was very important that I do both in the best of my abilities. So what do I regret? I certainly don't regret taking my time, and I don't regret raising, you know, 2 wonderful sons. And so, you know, it's really a personal question for each one of us. What do we want to prioritize at what point in our lives? I mean, now, especially with COVID, it's impossible to say, you know, what a personal priority looks like if you have a lot of people depending on you. So the only thing I would say on that is just make sure you communicate what your priority is, and, you know, be authentic about why it is that it is an important thing for you. And then the rest, I think, is going to work out. And if it doesn't, I'm a little bit of the kind of person that believes in destiny. I mean, we will find the ways in which things will work out for the best. But, you know, if I told you that I'd put a wrong step forward in, you know, in doing a certain transaction or in, you know, pursuing a promotion, I don't think I was, you know, in any way focused on these small steps. I think if you take a broader view of your career and on your life in general, that's how I've tried to conduct myself.
Fantastic. That's a very, very, very good piece of advice, because sometimes we really need to step back and think about it in that way, you know, long term, and not this anxiety of, because it is a long journey.
It really is a very long one, if you're lucky.
It is a long journey. Natalia, this has been fantastic. Really, we're so thankful, and I'm sure that we're going to get more questions later. People are going to keep thinking about this, about what you just said, and you've given us a lot of food for thought. It's been great to have you. A big honor, and for us to have you with us, and you sharing all this experience in the world of investment banking, which is, you know, huge, and with all these challenges that you've had, because if what's happened in the industry, it's an industry that's had a lot of challenges since, you know, throughout these years. So I thank you a lot. Thank you. Thank
you all for taking the time to spend it with me this morning, and I wish you all well. I'm available if anyone wants to shoot me an email, Cecilia, like I said.
Yes, I will share. Yeah, I will share that. And if you have anything you want me to share with all, you know, this piece of article, of course, whatever what you wrote, I will do that. And thank you, everybody.
Thank you. Have a great day.
Thank you very much, Natalia.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.